This video was made in collaboration with Rokoko. Thanks, Rokoko.
Rokoko very kindly sent me their full motion capture package for this video, including the Smart Suit Pro 2, the smart gloves, and the facial capture rig, which I didn't use for this video. So I used the motion capture suit to create the animation for some of the shots. Let's start off at the beginning with the model. This is the same model from my previous Iron Man video, but this time I gave the shaders a bit of an overhaul. I added much more wear and tear and damage to the suit to make it look a bit more battered, mostly by adding some extra decals into the shader editor and adding extra UV maps to place them around on the suit. This went a long way to make the suit look less perfect. Before we get too stuck in, all the assets and project files from this video are going to be available on my Patreon, so if you'd like to download the suit or the animation files or the compositing in Nuke, you can get access to all of that and have a play yourself. Okay, back to the video. After that, I started on the plane environment for the first shot. I had a quick look online but couldn't find anything suitable, so I decided to largely make this from scratch. I downloaded a few free assets from online libraries like the cases and the crates. And then for the actual interior of the plane, it was a combination of modelling and sculpting it from scratch, and then hand painting some of the textures combined with PBR materials, and then using some existing pieces to add some detail from a kit bash kit that I already had. For the sky in the background, I downloaded a 16K aerial HDRI from Production Crate, and I used this in Nuke for the actual background, and I also used it in Blender to light my scene, as well as a Blender sun lamp. With the environment created, it was time for some character animation. This first shot was one of the ones I used the motion capture suit for. I planned the shoot for this quite meticulously beforehand. I wanted to capture the footage of my face and also the motion capture from the suit simultaneously, so I set up my camera and a few lights in the hallway in my flat, which was the largest open space that I had to run in a straight line. I chose this angle specifically because it had a big window behind me that lit me with lots of natural light from the back. Although it's not perfect, this roughly simulated the light coming in from the back of the plane as the door opens. And then I put an LED tube light above my head, which is mimicking one of the lights that I added in Blender to light up the suit. So that way the lighting direction and colour roughly matches between my live action footage and the CG, which will massively help to bed it in later. I filmed this scene holding a real snowboarding helmet. Holding a physical object keeps my hands in the correct position relative to each other, and it also sells the action of putting it on my head more as I'm actually doing that movement. Then once it's all set up, I hit record, set my little piece to camera at the start of the video, and then turned around and did a big running jump. With everything captured, I then processed the motion capture in Rokoko Studio, which is their software that works alongside the motion capture suit and allows you to refine and process the animation slightly before exporting to something like Blender. In this case, I just had to do a little bit of tweaking the foot locks so that they stuck to the floor as I was running, and then I exported the animated skeleton from Rokoko Studio and imported it into Blender. I then used Rokoko's add-on for Blender to retarget the motion capture animation onto the rig for my suit. There were a few moments that needed some refinement, so I added an extra animation layer and then added some keyframes onto some of the bones to tweak their position. It didn't take long, and then I was pretty happy with the result. I also added a few keyframes to rotate and move some of the parts of the suit. For example, the shoulder pads need to move independently from the arms and the torso, and by default, because I was unconstrained when I was doing the motion capture, my arms moved in a way that the suit wouldn't be able to move, and so it was causing some clipping on the mesh where the shoulder pads were going through the torso or the arms. Now, because the footage of my head isn't actually in the 3D scene, it's missing some light interaction. To fix this, I took a generic model of a human head, did a project from view unwrap on it, and took one frame of the footage of my face and mapped it onto the head. I then put it in its own collection and set it to indirect only, so it won't be seen in the render, but it will cast reflections on the suit, and the geometry of the head will also block the tube light that's above me and cast some shadows on the neck. At this point, the 3D scene for this shot was basically finished. I added one final bit of refinement, which was adding a displace modifier onto the crates and using some noise to make them ripple, which made it look like the tarpaulin was blowing in the wind as the door opened. Pretty subtle, but it just brings the fairly static environment to life slightly. Then I rendered out the suit and the background separately, and it was time to comp them together in Nuke. To get the footage of my head to stick onto the suit perfectly, I began by doing a 2-point stabilize by tracking my ears. This makes it a lot easier to roto when it's not moving, and it also means I can export a 3D card from Blender that's parented to the neck bone of the suit, and then put my face on that geometry in Nuke's 3D system, and that will make my head perfectly stick. For my hair, because the detail is much finer, I did a luminance key against the white background as opposed to rotoing it. This gave me a very usable matte for my hair that I can then combine with the roto of my face to create an overall matte for my head. I also brought in the suit geometry as an alembic and used it to create a holdout in front of the card so my neck wouldn't appear in front of the suit. I then took the alpha of the suit and eroded and blurred it slightly, and used that to grade down my neck to create a contact shadow, giving the impression the suit is actually casting shadows on the footage of my face. Also, there was slightly more ambient light in the footage of me compared to the Blender scene because I filmed in a white corridor, so I countered this by adding a few soft masks onto my face and graded them down to create some areas of shadow and more accurately match the scene in Blender so my face fit in more. I then used a cryptomat and selected the foreground arms and helmet and put them back on top of the face so they would part in front of it as I lift the helmet up to my head. And then I moved on to making the background look a bit better. I used cryptomats to grade things up and down in the background slightly, as well as utilising the normals pass to add some relighting to some of the surfaces. Although the lighting from Blender looked pretty good, there were a couple of bits that felt a bit flat, and by using the normals pass I can add some extra highlights onto certain surfaces. This makes them catch the light and look a bit better, and it can enhance the silhouettes of things that get lost in the background otherwise. The next few shots are fully hand animated. I could have done this with the motion capture suit, but I would have made a total fool of myself, which I would hate to put on the internet. And also, there wasn't a huge amount of animation to do, as the pose was fairly static throughout all the shots. Once I was happy with the movement, I then moved on to creating the smoke trails, which is one of my favourite effects from the video. Rather than doing a smoke simulation, I did this with a particles system, emitting small spheres that have a volume shader on them. First, I parented a small emitter to each of the hands and feet, and then I baked this animation to keyframes so it's no longer parented. If you don't do this step, you get lots of subframing issues where the particles aren't emitting fast enough. I added some randomness to the size of the particles, and then also parented a point light at the source of the hands and feet. This lit up the smoke trails and gave them more of a fiery effect at the point of emission. I also rendered a separate pass that was just the 4 emitters on their own with an emission material on them. Then in Nuke I added a really strong glow onto these and put them underneath the suit. This does a lot of the heavy lifting for the repulsor effects in all the flying shots. Once all that comes together, it's looking pretty good. And then the part that I think really sells all these shots is the light interaction. I added moments of lens flares coming off of the repulsors, a few frames of dirt on the lens whenever Iron Man is passing the camera, as well as some off-screen flares that would be coming from the sun. The next wide shot was fairly simple. The Iron Man suit is animated along a path to go more or less straight down with a bit of rotation. I added the smoke trails again using the same technique as before. The background of the sky is the same HDRI loaded into Nuke and put on a massive sphere, and then I'm filming it through the 3D camera from Blender, exported into Nuke. To add a little bit of depth and parallax into the shot, I also added a cloud that I made from a noise texture onto a 3D card and placed this much closer to the camera so there would be some difference in movement between the foreground and the background. Otherwise the shot felt a little bit flat. Again, there's some subtle light effects. I added another lens flare on top of this shot, and also keyed the very hottest highlights from the smoke trail, and added some subtle horizontal flares onto these. I also multiplied them by a noise curve. By controlling the min and max values, I can dictate how much it goes up and down, and also how quickly, and I used this to create a slight flickering effect, so they had some inconsistencies. This made the effect feel a bit more dynamic than just a static flare. The close-up POV shot is exactly the same process again. This is probably my favourite shot, I think it looks really cool. There's only a few keyframes on the suit throughout the whole shot. I moved the hands around a tiny bit and had the torso twisting around throughout the shot. But for the most part, the subtle wobbling is coming from noise modifiers. I added a few onto the fingers to make them move, as well as the arm, and also onto the leg, which is what the camera is parented to. And that's partly where the cool camera shake feel from the shot is coming from. It has a small amount of depth of field on the foreground leg, which I added in comp, using the depth pass from Blender. And then again, what really sells it is the interaction with the light and the lens flares coming off of the repulsor. And then for all of the CG shots, I added some extra lens artifacts on top, like lens distortion, chromatic aberration, bloom and light wrap, and halation on some of the hottest highlights. This last step really brings everything together and makes it feel less CG because of the imperfections. For the final shot coming into land, I shot this in quite a particular way. I was concerned that doing a very fast tilt down would be difficult to camera track due to the amount of motion blur, so for safety I did it in 2 takes. I did one plate starting looking at the sky and slowly panned down, then in comp I would retime this to be a lot faster and add some additional motion blur to sell it, and then I filmed a second plate starting in the end position and just getting the action as the suit lands, getting some proper camera shake to sell it in. With those 2 elements in Nuke, I can then find a good middle point to do a transition and switch between the 2 plates, essentially stitching them together. Because it's such a fast move and there's lots of motion blur, it's completely seamless. I did a 3D camera track on this second part of the shot, and then for the 3D move on the first part, I literally just animated the camera to tilt upwards, essentially extending the camera track that I did backwards. Because the suit is flying down so quickly, it's quite forgiving, and I managed to roughly match the perspective just by doing a few keyframes on the camera. The animation work on the suit in this shot is a hybrid, so it's a combination of hand animation as the suit is coming in, and then I did a mocap scene of myself just jumping up and landing in the final position, giving the thumbs up to the camera, and that's the end of the shot. I didn't even bother stitching the 2 together. I just got the last frame of the hand animated part at the beginning to line up pretty well with the first frame of the motion capture. Then I rendered both of them separately and literally switched between them in Nuke. There's so much motion blur from the tilt that you can't even see the takeover. Just like the other shots, this has the smoke trails and then a healthy dose of lens dirt and lens flares coming off the suit as it comes into land. And then as the suit touches down, I added a couple of dirt elements from Production Crate to kick up some dust from the floor to make it a bit more impactful. The very last step before the video is done is to bring it into Resolve, give it a bit more contrast and love in the color grade, as well as adding some cool sound design elements to sell it all in. And once again, here is the final result.
This video was made in collaboration with Rokoko. Thanks, Rokoko.
Again, I'd like to say a massive thank you to Rokoko for sending me the motion capture suit to use in my videos. This collaboration was a dream come true. I've seen other creators on YouTube using Rokoko motion capture suits for years, and to be approached by them and asked if I would be interested in working with them was an absolute honour. You'll be seeing this suit appearing in many more of my videos in the future as well. Before we finish, again, the assets and project files from this video are on my Patreon. Consider checking it out, it really helps me to continue making videos like this. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.